Hi, everyone. Welcome to Journey 32. And today we have Jenn Seniuk on the podcast. And really excited for this episode. Things kind of came about really randomly. And
So
um,
random.
as it usually turns out, we actually have a whole bunch of connections that we didn't know about.
Yeah. Oh my God, totally.
But it's also a topic that I don't know a ton about. And so I'm really excited to kind of dig in and just let my curiosity go and find out a little bit more about what you do and you as a person on a little bit of a deeper level. But before we get into it, I just wanted you to introduce yourself. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, kind of what you're doing right now,
Sure.
maybe a little bit about like where you grew up and what you were like as a kid, anything that comes to mind.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, um, I'm Jen, and I'm the founder of Belly Eye Art Therapy, and it's now a business. It didn't start as a business. It actually started as like a passion project, and it's so funny how it came about. I was milking cows on a dairy farm in southern Australia, and I had this like aha moment of like, the world needs to know about art therapy. So anyways, like even just getting to that point in my life was so random. So I'm originally from like a very small town. I don't know if anyone knows, but Rocky Mountain House, it's out near like Red Deer
I
area. And then so
yeah.
yeah, very small town. But I've always been kind of the black sheep. I'm very much like, I need to see the world, like run, go, explore. And everyone, because it's a small town, was very much like, what? Like, why? That's scary. That's terrifying. Like, where are you going? I'm like, I don't know. I got some stuff in my backpack. Like, let's just go. Yeah. And then it's so funny because I actually started in school as a teacher. Like I was
Okay.
going to be an education teacher. I really wanted to teach language arts.
Okay.
And then when I got to the U of L, I was like, oh my God, I'm failing like most of my English classes because this is so not the creative side of English that I thought it was going to be. It's not like dioramas and like poster boards and acting out presentations of Romeo and Juliet. It's like 5 papers a week, fail. Yeah, and it was so wild. So I actually took an art therapy class to boost my GPA, and I had no idea what it was.
Okay.
And I was like, this is sweet. I'm good at art. I'm going to get into the ed program this way. And then I started taking the class and I was like, holy shit, this is what I want to do with my life. I had no idea this was an option. And it was like, it was a summer class. And so I talked to the professor and she was like, amazing, but you have to go to the States. Like, you can't do this in Canada.
Mm.
And it was wild. My life took a 180 because I was set on being a teacher since I was like 7 years old. And so my boyfriend and I broke up and we were together for like 4 years living together. I put in this application and I got accepted. And so I took a couple of years off to go traveling, but I ended up out in Pennsylvania to do my
Okay.
master's. And so that's always been like my story is like just taking the risk, going for it, not really know how it's going to work out, and then just go. And it so far it's been working out. But yeah, that's kind of the backstory of how I got into art therapy.
That's super cool. And I think that I'm really curious because I think that a lot of us are
Mhm.
have those times in our lives, have those moments where it's like, oh, I feel like I should do this, but it's a huge jump. And like you said, it's a
Yeah.
complete 180. And it was
Mm.
leaving, it sounds like basically your entire life behind and doing
Yeah.
something that you didn't really have a grand plan for. You just kind of felt
No.
pulled to do it. Yeah. And so I'm
Yes.
curious for you at least, how did that decision process go? Was it just you knew so much, it was just such a strong knowing that you just jumped at it and that was kind of the way you've always done things? Or what gave you call even like the courage to make that big of a jump by yourself?
I think it's so weird looking back on it all. Like, I was thinking about this the other day and I'm like, there had to have been some sort of divine intervention or something bigger than me because it makes no sense. Like, systemically, it makes no sense how I got there because, like, the way I was raised, the small town I grew up in, like, everything pointed in the opposite direction. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But, like, how I went was so against the grain and it pushed against, like, what my family believed at the time, what my friends were believing. There was, like, a lot pushing against me, and so I don't even know if I can totally answer that. There was just something that I knew and I'd never felt before. that was such a strong knowing that I had to do it. And
Yeah.
even like in the process of applying, there was all these complications. And I just remember my poor mom was like, it's a sign, Jennifer. It's a sign. Don't go forward. It's a sign. Nah, it's good.
Yeah. It's fine. I'm going to keep going. Yeah.
And I don't even know what it was, but after I took that risk, it was so much easier to trust my gut. Because I
Yeah.
think that was like the biggest pivotal moment in my life.
Yeah.
And I've already had a passion for travel. Like I did these smaller trips, like went to Europe in high school and like did this volunteer project in the Dominican. But there was something so different about this gut feeling I've never ever experienced before. I don't think I could, I don't even think I had a choice to ignore it,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think I've had a couple of those in my life too. And I almost describe them as knowings. It's not even just like,
Yeah.
it's like, and
Yeah.
it almost doesn't matter what else comes up. It's just such a strong feeling that you're just like, no, I have to do this. This is what I'm going to do. And it doesn't really matter, the potential risks or
Totally.
the outcome or whatever it might be. I have to do this and I need to follow it.
That's so true. Actually, that just kind of like jarred something for me. Like, I think that was something that I saw a lot was a lot of people surrounding me had a lot of regrets, a
Yeah.
lot of regrets for not taking the risks. So I think that was really the seed that got planted was that I refused. I refused to be that person. I refused to do that. Because I remember thinking like, I never, ever, ever want to put that on my partner. I never, ever want to put that on my future children if I choose to have kids. I never want to put that on like my friends or whatever. And so I think it's funny, I totally forgot about that. But I think that was really the moment that I was like, I know how that has jeopardized people's relationships around me. And I just never wanted to be that person. So I
Was-
think that was really the root of it. And then, yeah, that strong knowing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have to, because if I don't, I know it's just gonna, I'm gonna be so pissed later down the road.
And that's actually really interesting too, where you must have had, like a lot of insight and empathy when you were younger, because I think those are some of the things that people don't typically look at is yes, they see
Yes.
regret, but they don't go that level deeper
Yeah.
of, take people taking it out on others, taking it out on their
Mhm.
children and trying to live through their children.
Yeah.
I didn't make it or I didn't pursue my dreams. And so now you need to go and achieve my dream for me. Or, those lashing out at the people around them or lashing out at their partner and putting that on them. Because I think a lot of people do that subconsciously and don't even realize that that's what they're
Totally.
doing. And so the
Totally.
fact that you could even see that when you were going and that stuck with you is really almost amazing. Because
Thank
again, I
you.
don't think that people at the end of their life really even notice that. They know that there's
Yeah.
regret, they know that there is the what if game, but I don't think they realize how it affects everything
Mm.
around them as well.
I think also the thing that like really shifted my perspective is that I had like such a strong connection with my grandma and I spent a lot of time with her because both my parents worked full time. Like we were middle class, like I'd say lower middle class.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with my grandma a lot. And then she got really, really sick and had cancer. And we were like walking this really brutal path with her at like the end of her life. And I think that was really something that shifted my perspective is because she would always say that, like,
Mm-hmm.
go have fun.
Yeah.
Don't wait. Like, look at me. Don't wait. And I think that also was like, oh, okay, now I can see it in a different way, being such a young kid. Because I was only 14 when that happened.
Yeah.
And then, like, even looking at everyone around my grandma too. And then, like, listening to what she'd have to say too, like on her deathbed, I think was just like, oh shit. And kind of put me in that position to think differently too.
And do you think that because you said that you were kind of the black sheep and you would kind of,
Mm,
go out on your own and everyone around you had a very, call it, rigid view of what
yes.
you're supposed to do. And yet you still almost fought against that or did your own thing.
Mhm.
Did that start happening after that experience with your grandma, or was that always in you already, even before that, and that almost just amplified it?
Mm. I think it was after,
Yeah.
like reflecting back on it, I honestly think it was after. And then it was just like really around the time when I like moved out when I was 17, because I was able to start university just before I turned 18.
Yeah.
And I think it was really around then that was like, oh shit, like I'm literally out of the system. Like I went to Lethbridge, and so there was that literal distance. And I remember I like, when was it? I think I was in therapy at some point. No, that was way later. But there was a time when someone was like, you can make your own decisions. Like you're an adult.
Yeah.
Like you were 18, you were allowed to make your own decisions. And it was like, oh, okay, that's like the reassurance that I needed. I needed to hear that. Amazing, let's go. But the other thing that's like really interesting is like now that I'm getting older and my grandpa's getting a lot older, and so I'm coming into possession of a lot of like his stuff growing up, and he's like sharing a lot of stuff. So like last weekend when I was home, he found these old love letters that like he wrote to my grandma,
Wow.
and he's like giving me a lot of his stuff to like decorate my house and all this. But the more I'm looking at it and the more I'm like hearing stories about my family, I'm realizing that I wasn't the forerunner and the person that was paving the way.
Yeah.
It was actually my grandma. It was actually like her family. It was like my grandpa's or my dad's grandma, so my baba. And
Yeah.
you know, like when they came to Canada and they did all this stuff, it was actually them. And so I'm a lot more connected to that. And I didn't realize that until I'm getting older and I'm like digging into the stuff and I'm looking more at my history and I'm talking to people. It's like, no, this wasn't me. I like to take credit for it, but it was so not me.
And it, in different ways too. And,
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
started looking into a little bit of my family history recently, just closer, and realizing just some of the stories, because I think it probably would have been the same generation. It was my great grandparents, and they moved, from the Ukraine here. And some of the
Mhm.
stories of like, literally, here's your plot of land, go clear a forest and
Yeah,
build yourself a house, right? Like,
totally, totally.
and, there's, just having the will to go and do that, step into the uncertainty, and
Mm,
yeah, just kind of carve their own paths. It's different, but it very much so is the same.
totally.
But something that I'm just a little bit interested in, because I have a lot of friends that are from small towns, and I don't think it's
Mhm.
necessarily just small towns, but there are different groups that are very structured in the way that things should be, right?
Yeah, right.
This is the way everybody does it. This is what's expected of you. This is
This is safe.
yes. And I was just curious, in your opinion, growing up in that, what do you think, where do you think that comes from a lot of times? Is it that safe, or is it, um, does it come from somewhere else, from maybe like the pressure from the families? But where do you think that comes from? And, for you, you had a really strong knowing, but what advice would you give people if, they feel like they're being put into a box that they don't necessarily want to live in,
Mm,
and they want to break?
ooh, that's good. Because I think you touched on something that's really good too, is like if people want to get out of that box or if they really enjoy it, like those are two different things. And like I think a lot of people when they hear my story and I'm talking about it and sharing my life, I've had a lot of people assume that I'm making judgments
Mm,
and that I'm putting myself on a pedestal.
yeah.
And so like that's also coming from like their own stuff that's being triggered, because I don't feel like in any way I'm like, this is wrong, shame.
Yeah.
But it's touching on something that's obviously like really sensitive or being triggered for them. And that's okay. Like that's fine. I can take that. But I think for me, I really think it comes down to safety and like looking back on all of it, because like our actions come from two sources. It's either love or fear. And so I just think that there's a lot of fear in the unknown.
Yeah.
And like we're wired as human beings to not feel uncomfortable. Like we don't want to feel uncomfortable. Like our safety mechanism is to feel the least amount of comfort. And that's like where addiction comes into, because we don't want to address this. We don't want to sit in the discomfort.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times it's like the system has just known how to survive. If you do A, if you do B, if you do C, if you do D, and it's fine and it's great and it works. And then so the next generation, okay, mom and dad did this, amazing. It worked. That's the life I want. But I think like if you want something different, it's tough. It's so tough, but and like it also comes from a place of privilege. Like I had privilege to get out and make those decisions, and I recognize that as well. And I think if you're in a place where you can access that, take the risk.
Yeah.
And I know it's so much easier said than done, but if you trust yourself, everything's like in alignment. And I mean, it kind of goes, I'm like a spiritual person. So I'm very much like, trust the process. If it doesn't work out, you'll figure out a plan B.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess my advice is just find someone that'll support you in taking that risk, ally with them and take the risk. Because you only need one person in your corner really to do this if it feels really scary.
For sure. And, it's funny for me looking at it too. A lot of times I would kind of talk myself through the worst case scenario of like,
Yeah.
okay, at the end of the day, if I do this and everything goes terribly and I fall
Mm,
flat on my face and,
yeah.
quote unquote fail,
Yeah.
I can always go back to that safe life. I can always go
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
to where I was, or whatever it might be. Maybe it'll be a couple years later, but it'll still be there for me. And
Yeah.
or I can still recover from whatever I did. And so that kind of bred a lot of safety for me. I'm just like, okay, now I know what the worst case scenario is. I don't have to be afraid of it anymore. And so I can step into it.
Totally. And I think people that can also walk through that might also be like, okay, but then if I come back and I failed, then I feel shame.
Yeah.
Okay, but who's judging you?
Yeah.
If someone's judging you, are they your friend? Are they in your corner? Is it actually you that you're afraid of judging yourself? Where is that coming from? And like, if you can dig into that, that fear is gone. It's not there.
Yeah. And, again, balancing almost what we talked about before too, of, yeah, some people might look down on you or some people might judge you or try to shame you into it.
Mhm.
But in my opinion, I would rather have that than the regret for my
Yeah.
entire life
Yeah.
and sitting in that regret.
Totally. And it's so funny, like the biggest takeaway from like all the traveling I've done and coming back is like after pushing through all these like societal norms, whatever, boxes that people are trying to put me in because I fit a certain box in their life.
Yeah.
But when I travel, I come back a different shape and I don't fit.
Yeah.
So one, it's like being comfortable with that, but also I would say 80-90% of the people that had something to say always were encouraging or always reflected on, wow, my life has not changed in the time that you were gone and came back, but
Yeah.
you actually went and did this or that. And then it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so then they just start having their own conversations about it,
Yeah.
which is really cool.
Yeah. And, for me, it was less physically traveling and more going through a big personal development change and kind of walking that journey and,
Yeah.
changing a lot of my internal world. And that quite literally shifted my external a ton. And and all of my relationships changed. And, the really cool thing was, just like you said, was that 80 or 90% of those people were super encouraging, or were supportive, where our relationship got stronger. They
Yeah.
were, they admired the whatever had happened and they wanted to start
Totally.
those conversations. And
Totally.
that support showed when I did get those negative reactions from people of, oh, actually this is them, this isn't me.
Yeah.
And that's, them, me not fitting into the character or the box that they wanted me to stay in for our relationship is actually a reflection on them, not on me. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge blow up or a fight or anything like
Totally.
that, but it kind of shows you which relationships are important in your life at this moment and which ones aren't as important.
Totally. 1000%.
Yeah.
And so like I'm curious, did you do the work on your own or did you go to therapy? What was like your process in
Yeah.
that?
I did a bunch of different ones. So I started out with more like traditional therapy. So I started seeing a therapist, saw her for a couple of years, held a ton of shame around it, did not tell anybody.
Totally.
Yeah, like even, I've told the story a couple times, but didn't even tell my sister, who is the closest person to me in my life, and held a ton of shame around it because it was me. I was always supportive of other people doing that sort of thing, but because it's me, it's not okay. So I did that for a while. Then I started to explore and still do therapy. But then I started to explore also more group settings. And so I joined a men's group, which is essentially like, group therapy with a bunch of men, but not led by, a quote unquote professional. Did that for about a year. And then just have continued on with therapy and just done a lot of my own kind of research, and I'm looking for the next piece to jump into. And even honestly, like the podcast has been super helpful for me, and
So
tackling a
good.
lot of my problems and talking to other people and hearing their experiences has actually been super therapeutic for myself as well.
I love it. That's the creative outlet. Like that's amazing. That's your creative expression in this.
Yeah, and it's funny because I never considered myself a creative person. I was always like, no, I'm logical, scientific, I'm not creative.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and it led me to redefining the definition of creativity, because in
Amazing.
my life, creativity had always been like, well, I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't write a great story, so therefore I'm not creative. And
Mm,
that was a big mental hurdle for me to get over, of like, no, that's not the only type of creativity out there, right? Like I can
yeah.
be creative in my professional life, I can be creative with my interactions with people, I can be creative just by the way I interact, or having outlets like this or whatever it might be. And so changing that narrative was huge for me as well.
Oh, that's literally what I talk about all the time because I feel like a lot of people have an assumption of what art therapy is.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, it's coloring, drawing, that's it.
Yeah.
I have to be good at it. I have to be perfect. And no, anyone can participate. Like anyone can do it as long as you can. No, there's not even limits to it. Anyone can do it. And it doesn't matter how old you are, who you are. And so I always tell people too, for me, art therapy isn't just the pens, the papers, the paint. Yeah, that's a part of it, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the in-between stuff. It's the things, the little things. So like when you're going for a mindful walk and you're crunching the leaves and you can smell fall and you can hear the sound. It's the random conversations when you met through so and so, through so and so, through so and so. It's the really awful, ugly singing in your car when like the Spice Girls come on or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the in-between stuff too. So it's so accessible to anyone. It doesn't have to be this big elaborate show.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I often ask clients too, as soon as they're like, I can't do this, I'm not good, is whose voice are you hearing?
Yeah.
Who is that? Because that's not you. That's not how you were wired. And yeah, and then we just kind of dig into that. Like, who are you hearing? And what other areas of your life are you hearing the same voice? And where is it coming from?
Yeah. That's a huge one, and one that I have done and still am doing a lot of work around, is
Mm,
that idea of the inner critic and whose voice are you hearing. And
yeah.
a lot of times you don't even realize that it's somebody else's.
Oh,
You don't realize
no,
where it's coming from,
really.
or that it's been there for so long that you think it's a truth, right? Or like, no, that's just what I am or who I am. And, oh,
Mm,
actually, no, it was when I was 8 years old. I was told that the way I was drawing mountains was wrong.
totally. Oh my God, totally.
Therefore, I'm not good at drawing, or
Mm,
I did things wrong, or I need to make sure that I, do them accurately or the way that other people want them to be done. And that's, a very specific example, but one that spreads so far in your life.
yes, totally. And it's such a metaphor. And that underlying shame message is so embedded that it like seeps into these cracks of other parts of our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's just scary.
so I'd love for you to kind of expand a little bit more on what exactly art therapy is and what it means
Yeah.
to you, and the type of things that you do, because I honestly had no idea and still don't have a very good idea. I
Mhm.
know you
Yeah.
talked a little bit about so much more than just the pens and the paper and the paints. But what does it look like? What do people expect? And what are some of the things that you're working on, that you're going through?
Okay, that's great. So like the the elevator, like 10-second pitch for art therapy is when words are not enough, we make art.
Cool.
So it's really boiled down to when you have this feeling and when things you just don't have the words for, it's like a sensation or like a movement or just like total pure bliss, but the words are just not big enough to hold that energy. You make art about it. And the art is the communication that you're using. It's the language that you're speaking through in sessions. And so it's really vulnerable to make art because, like you said, there's these times when you're a kid and you're putting yourself out there, and then someone's like, you failed.
Yeah.
you get an F on this, or hang it up in front of everyone and everyone will judge it and critique it. So it's really vulnerable, because when you're making art, you're literally like taking what's inside of you and putting it in front of you so you can have a conversation with it and see it. So it's visible and you can work on it. But if someone is criticizing that, why would anyone want to open up? It makes sense that people shut down, and their defense immediately is, I'm not good. Because it's easier to say that and preface that than be like, here it is. I don't care what you think. This is who I am.
Yeah.
It takes time to get there for a minute. But that's why you come to a professional art therapist, someone that's gone to school for this. Like, I have a master's in counseling and art therapy. So we do both talk therapy and art therapy in a session and kind of intertwine them. And so what I specifically focus on is emotional regulation. And so it's about regulating the emotions so that you are more in control of the emotions. You can feel your emotions, but the emotions are not controlling you. And so that's like the solid foundation that we have to work with before we can even get into trauma work, before we can get into processing these deeper shame messages. Because if you don't know how to regulate, it's not going to be safe for you to go out there in the world. And I just open you up and you're like, oh God, okay, like what are my toxic coping skills to use to help like get rid of this feeling?
Yeah.
And so the art making is amazing, because when you make art, you're rewiring the pathways in your brain. You're healing trauma already, just like on a basic level. So trauma is stored on the nonverbal side of your brain. And anytime you're creative, doesn't matter what kind of outlet, anytime you're creative, you're already moving that nonverbal trauma to the verbal side of your brain where it's automatically being released. Like, that's a really watered down version of it,
Yeah.
but
Cool.
You're already healing by just being creative. And then so when you tie in therapy to that, there's ways that you can kind of bring up these crunchy parts or the shame messages and look at them. But the nice thing is that when it's in front of you, you now have an opportunity for power, for control, for empowerment. You get to choose, maybe for the first time in your entire life, what you want to do with that. Do you want to rip it up? Do you want to change the narrative? Do you want to add more to it? Do you want to save it? Do you want to create more and elaborate more on it? What do you want to do? And you can do it at an arm's length. So you can say, you can speak in third person. You can speak about the art. You can speak about someone else experiencing this art. And then when you're ready, your subconscious will know when to own it. And often I'll hear clients where it's like, oh yeah, that person in the picture is going to climb up over that mountain, but they're scared, but they don't have the tools. They don't know how to do this. And then we'll talk about that in that metaphor of, okay, well, what are some other options? Can they dig a hole? Can they go around? Can they call a friend? Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
And then eventually you'll hear them be like, that's me.
Yeah.
This is this part of my life. This is this event. And then you can kind of open it up a bit more. But this is the one thing I say with everyone. This is why it's so important to see a professional when you're doing this work, because art therapy is so vulnerable. And if it's done wrong, it can be super traumatic. Yeah. And so like when I first came back to Calgary, I was like, I don't know, on Kijiji looking for jobs. And someone was like, I'm in my basement running art therapy sessions. I have no art therapy experience. I thought I would just practice with someone for free. Like, oh God, no.
And you know, it's crazy hearing you talk about that, and it makes so much sense of being able to take almost the personal aspect of it out. And like, no, you know, I'll look at this, you know, character that I've created and we'll talk about what they're struggling with. And, you know, it's something that I still do. It's so easy for me to talk to other people, to, you know, like, oh, this is what's going on. I can see that, like, you know, and try to, you know, give them advice or, you know, talk through something. So easy. As soon as I look at myself, it's like, no. You know, it's all of a sudden, I don't know what's going on. It's a lot tougher to, like, you know, see clearly the whole picture, because it's so personal, and because at least for me, you know, it's just a very, very different experience talking about myself or looking at my own life as opposed to other people's. And, you know, the other one that was interesting is you talked about emotional regulation. And that was one of the things that I discovered, you know, through my work and through therapy, was that I had essentially turned off all of my emotions because I wasn't able to filter out just the good ones. Like, oh, I'll just feel happy and then, you know, not feel sad or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so because I didn't want to feel those negative emotions, I just turned all of them off.
Yeah.
And so learning how to regulate them, learning how to release them, some of the other ones were specifically for anger, of growing up in my house. Whenever there was anger involved, or whenever there was a fight, it was 10 out of 10. There was no like minor disagreement. There was no, like I'm a 3 out of 10 angry right now. It's either everything's fine or we're having like a screaming match.
Yeah.
And so because of that, and for a very long time, was very afraid of anger, because in my body would basically go right to that point. As soon as I feel a little bit of anger, if I enact on this, if I communicate that, I'm displeased or I'm angry at this, or I didn't like this happening, it's going to go to a 10 out of 10 screaming match.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And so,
well, that's like the way that society only allows men to show their emotions. It's only acceptable to be angry.
yes. And that's, one that we dug into a lot, like in the men's group. And just as I've started to explore that, is especially as a man, that is the one emotion you're allowed. You're not allowed to be sad. You're not allowed to show weakness. You have to always show strength and whatever it might be. And so a lot of other emotions get twisted into anger, or anger is used to cover them up. And so peeling back some of those layers was really powerful, and seeing it especially in other men as well, because we all come with our own experiences and our own baggage, and seeing how it shows up differently in people's lives.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh, there's so many art therapy directives that just like popped in my mind when you were talking. I was like, yes.
And so, I feel like a question that a lot of people would have is, what types of things, would art therapy help me with? Of like, if I'm feeling a certain way, or if I struggle with a certain thing, like, what are some of the different areas that you've worked with, or you've seen, or that you find is, especially helpful with people? And is it more about, what they're going through? Is it more about the type of person, or something completely different?
So the client that I specialize in is typically teens and adults.
Okay.
And then so like I'm qualified to work with kids, but the majority of people I'm working with are teens and adults. And so because I'm not totally set up the way I'd want to be if I was working with kids, because there's so many other cool things you can have in an office, and I just don't have space for it.
Yeah.
So I usually refer them to another art therapist who I know that's in the neighborhood of where I'm practicing at, and she specializes in kids, so we share back and forth that way. But anyone that's struggling with identity, that wants to learn about themselves, that's going through anxiety, depression, addiction, just old trauma that's coming up because of this stuff, old patterns that they're kind of stuck in, that loop, those narratives, any of that kind of stuff, I usually work with typically. In the past, I've worked at like a psychiatric hospital, so I've done some psych work before, and that was incredible, that work. And I've also worked in a treatment center as well. So I feel like I'm quite broad. It all kind of boils down to emotional regulation and just like your internalized messages, so identity, really.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's amazing. And one more thing that just because I have done a lot of work around it, is the idea of inner child work. And whether it's through like, art therapy, or just your own personal journey, or just what you've seen in other people, I would just love to hear some general thoughts on that, of like either experiences or what you've seen. And, for me, it was honoring that inner child, realizing like the inner child wounds that I'd had, and trying to work through a lot of those. So I just love if you have any thoughts at all.
Yes. So actually, this is wild. This is like a long haul story. So sometimes this happens with art therapy, is like when you're doing your work, like I know for myself, I'll look back at stuff like years ago that I made like in grad school, and something will click now because something has shifted in my subconscious, and I'm like, holy shit. Okay, that's what I was processing back then. This is how it's coming out now. And it's really cool because you can actually pull out the artwork and hold it side by side and be like, whoa, okay.
Very cool.
So there was a time in my practicum, I just had like a total meltdown. Like everything was going really, really well. And my supervisor was there and it was great. And there was like this day where I was like, I clammed up. I couldn't think. I couldn't even say. Like I literally was just standing in front of the group like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I freaked out. So my supervisor had to step in and like save the group. And this was like at the end of my practicum.
Yeah.
And I just lost it. And so her and I like got processing, and it was that inner critic. And it was, so then she got me to, and she wasn't even an art therapist. Like she's just amazing. But she was like, let's personify this. Like, how big is it? What does it look like? Is it an animal? Is it a human? Is it a thing? And so it was this teeny tiny little, I have it somewhere, it's like in a box somewhere, this little like monster. And so I went home and I made it out of clay, and it had all these little spikes all over it and these like really angry eyes. And I had to put it into a little cage because it didn't feel safe. Like it was wild when I was thinking about it and I was trying to sit and process with it. I would just be a mess. Like I was just a total complete mess. So I had to create a cage, and then I created a box for it. And it sat in that box, and I had a conversation with it through the box and the cage, and it was in there in all like the stuffing and stuff. And then so my supervisor and I talked about how we did a lot of parts work at that time as well. So like this was one part. And then so because that was so intense, I had to work on a different part that was more positive to kind of balance out how I was feeling inside. So it was a lot safer and easier to process what was going on.
Yeah.
And this little inner monster was like sabotaging things, but it was so angry,
Yeah.
so angry. Like that's why it was sabotaging, because it was like, bitch, look at me, I'm over here and I'm pissed off.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna cut you and sabotage everything until like you get the message. And then like eventually when I could sit and process it, it was like, okay, you're like really, really upset. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry to this part of me that I've like let down, and I'm afraid of you. And so like I was able to have this conversation. And then it wasn't until I was in Australia and I was working at this town that had 200 people in it, and I was working for a grain harvest season. And I like worked in this, it's called a classy hut.
Okay.
And these big trucks would drive by, hand me a slip, I'd scan it, they'd go on and get their grain. And I was like doing some art therapy stuff, like just journaling, whatever. And I made this image of this girl in like a little cage, but the door was open. And then I did some journaling and I didn't think anything of it. And I was like, oh, it's me, like, yay, something's good. And then I was like, wait a second. Oh my God, this is the monster. This person, this girl is my inner child. And she was just that angry that I couldn't even recognize her. I had no idea that that's even who she was, because there was that much hatred and that much anger and that much fear over top of her. But in this image, she was smiling and she was happy and she was like excited to climb out and experience where I was.
That's so incredible, and that's so crazy. And
I know, it's like the long haul game of art therapy.
yeah, well, it's interesting because I fought against meditation for a very long time. I still usually do. But
I know, yeah.
but every once in a while I'm very big on imagery. And for a little bit I was exploring like, oh, do I have a spirit animal, and trying to like, visualize through that. And it was interesting because I identified with a lion, but he had to be in a cage. And he wasn't, I don't know if it's because I was afraid of him or if because he was afraid. But over a couple months, as I kept going back there, it was okay, like, is he still in the cage? Yes. He's still in the cage. Yes. You let him out for a little bit, then he has to go back in. And then eventually leaving the door open and then letting him, roam free kind of thing. And don't know exactly what it means. And I haven't gone back to that place for a little while now, but it's just so interesting how powerful that image is. And hearing you talk about that story of the very strong imagery and having the cages and what we're afraid to let out and what's actually in them.
Can I offer some
I would
insight?
love this. Yeah.
And you can tell me if this resonates or not. Like, I don't want to project anything, but it's just when you're sharing that story, it just really reminds me of when you were talking about your anger at the beginning of the session, and how I was afraid to feel anything past it too, because I knew that it was like really volatile. And so I'm wondering if the lion, and you said the lion, maybe it's there to keep itself safe or keep others safe.
Yeah. And as I thought about it, and as I've kind of kept it in that subconscious and just not tried to dig in too much or overthink it. I think a lot of it is being afraid to let my true self out. And I think that's a lot of where it comes from, of yes, being afraid of it, of what I would actually be, or what I'm not capable of in a good way. And like, I'm not afraid of the line. And the line is like, even in that imagery, it's like, he's a friend. Like I go and I'll go and hug him and like, crazy stuff like that. And so it's not being afraid of him. It's almost of like, I'm not ready to let him out, or I don't feel safe allowing him to roam free. I don't know what it is, but yes, there's a lot.
Well, sometimes like amazing things that are happening are just as triggering as shitty things.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
If not more.
Yes. Yeah. And that's been one that I've been looking at a lot recently, is self-sabotage, the idea of self-sabotage, keeping yourself safe.
Yeah.
For a very long time, I identified as an overachiever. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. I'm an overachiever. I'm covering up stuff that way. And a little while back now, I was reading something and I read the definition of an overachiever. And I'm like, that's kind of me, but I know that I'm that. So it has to be me. And then right afterwards was the definition of an underachiever. I went, oh, am I actually an underachiever? Have I been holding myself back this entire time? Because it's not necessarily what I've done or what I've achieved. It's what I'm capable of doing. And just because, like the outside world viewed me as successful or that I had done a lot, when I looked at and actually asked myself inside, I realized I've been holding myself back the whole time. That even though I've achieved that stuff, I could have done more. That whenever I get to the point where it's a real turning point, I'm okay with just being there. I'll sabotage myself not to take that next step. Or, the way I think of it as, I want to be in the top 3, but I won't allow myself to be number 1 kind of thing. Yeah.
Damn, that's good. That's really good. I'm gonna go do some journaling today. Making around this.
Yeah. It was an interesting one, and one I'm still wrestling with. So, But before, we are getting close to time here, but I want to hear about your bus project, because we talked a little bit about it when we first met. And I'd love you to tell everybody a little bit more about it, what you're doing, and just expand on it.
So again, it's like another one of those random things that have just happened in my life. A friend of mine just knew of an abandoned bus, and she knew I wanted to convert a bus, and she was like, "Hey, I have a bus for you."
Okay.
So I had it towed from Seminar. And so it's out in Rocky Mountain House on my grandpa's property. And so I'm slowly renovating her. Her name's Thelma. I'm Louise. And my goal is to totally like fit her out so I can live and travel in her and go across Canada and talk about art therapy, advocate for art therapy, set up workshops, kind of like one-off short therapy groups or trainings, or whoever wants to collaborate, just do talks and stuff like that. And then just have my online clients when I'm in the bus.
So cool. And because you said that she knew you'd been looking for a bus for a little while. When did that idea first come to you? And what made you feel pulled to do it? Was that always like the full formed idea? Okay.
Actually, when I was in Australia,
yeah,
I had dated a guy that lived in a bus, and it's so random. He actually got his bus for a carton of beer, and he was a carpenter. And so he like fit the whole thing out and put it on like this random little block of land. And there was like a kitchen block and like shower block and stuff like that. And you'd like walk across this yard to go on the bus. And then when I was working at that grain harvest, I was like telling a friend of mine, I'm like, I just want to do it. I just want to do it. She was like, yes, amazing. Do it. I will come to Canada and visit you.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of fell into my lap. So I was like, okay, I guess this is what I'm meant to be doing. So I guess it's happening.
I love that. I find a lot of those are the best, when it's just kind of, it's been there and then it just drops into you and you're like, well, now I have to do it. It almost goes back to that knowing, right? That we talked about at the beginning of. It's just, it feels right. It feels like I'm supposed to do it. So I'm just going to do it.
Totally. This is the biggest thing I've ever manifested in my life. So I'm like, okay, if I can do this, if I can manifest a literal bus.
I have watched a couple of the videos of you working on it, and I'm
Yeah.
excited to see what it turns into.
Yay.
I'm really excited for that. And
Oh, me
um,
too. Me too.
as we're wrapping up here, I'm curious if there's anything that we didn't get to that you want to bring up, or if you have any questions, or just anything that comes to mind that we didn't get to.
I just want to share that myself and a good friend of mine, who's another art therapist from England, we have our own podcast as well. And it's called Our Art Therapy Life. And so it's just us having a conversation, kind of going back and forth about like art therapy and different themes and topics, but in no way is it for just art therapists. We want it to be about entrepreneurialism and women and just like, regular conversations that can be applied to anyone and anything. Off the top of my head, that's all I got right now.
No, that's okay. I'll make sure to put a link to it so that people can find it.
Sure.
And then if people are interested in learning more or following you, where would be the best place to do that? Like, would it be social media, or do you have a website, or where would be the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, I have all of the above. Actually, something else came to mind too. When we were talking about shame messages, I created a shame message worksheet. So you can kind of dig into what your internalized shame messages are and work on replacing them. So that's on my website. It's free. So just bellyeyearttherapy.com. And then all of my handles are the same. It's at bellyeyearttherapy.com on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all the same.
Awesome. I'll put links to those as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm so glad.
Oh, thank you.
Got to do it, and we got the random introduction and the random connections that made this happen. So,
yeah.
So again, just thank you so much. And I can't wait to chat some more.
Thanks for having me. This was awesome.